Welcome back to NostalgiaCast. I'm Darren Lundberg,
And I'm Johnny Craddock.
and we've got a bit of a special episode, kind of a companion piece or a sequel to an earlier episode this season, which was our Robin Hood conversation. And again, we had my mind's still blown. We had the director of Meet the Robinsons and Winnie the Pooh and Steven Anderson. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. Good to see you, Darren. Good to see you, Johnny.
Yeah,
Thank you.
welcome back. Like I said, it was like we've just all the chats. Like I can't, I don't know. Social media is just crazy that we're able to become friends like this, and it's just been such an honor. Like, and I don't know what it is. Like as soon as we started chatting, all this Meet the Robinsons stuff started popping up all over Twitter, and so I hope you don't mind. But every time one of those things comes up, I'm like, oh, tagging him, oh, tagging him. I,
No, I appreciate it.
I,
It's lovely to see.
yeah, I just want to make sure that you know that you're beloved. Like that actually made a dent on some people, and I know that you don't feel like the movie is promoted as much as I guess as it should, but it's out there and it's getting to the right people. So
Yeah.
again, we're so excited to have you back on. We chatted briefly about your book, that's
Yes.
upcoming. I think September 10th. Is that the
Yeah.
release date?
Correct.
Okay. So we had this in the books for a bit. We mentioned off air. You're so funny because we're direct messaging each other, and you messaged me like, I feel embarrassed asking you this, but would it be okay to like promote my book on your show? Would it be okay to come back? And I'm like, you're embarrassed. Why are you like? I'm embarrassed that you're talking to me. Like it's crazy. So of course we're gonna have you back on, but
Awesome.
we talked briefly about the book, and because again, it wasn't. This is before you sent us like copies, which we do appreciate. Thank you for helping us out with
Mhm.
that, so we can know what we're talking about. But
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I should start. How does it feel? Like again, you're an artist, you're a director, you're an animator, you're a voice actor. Now you're an author. How does it feel?
It's very weird. It's very surreal. I never thought I could write a book. Um,
And a very good book, I want to say.
thanks. Well, even just writing the book was like the first like that was the accomplishment. The fact that I was able to do it and complete it, and it's out, well, almost out. Many people have already gotten their pre-orders, so
Yeah,
people are actually holding it in their
yeah,
hands,
like this right
like that right there.
here.
Um, Pretty surreal.
Yeah,
It's kind of a full circle moment for me because I grew up with loving not just Disney movies, but books on Disney. I was always saving up my allowance and going to the mall with my mom to, B. Dalton's or Walden Books, the old mall bookstores, and finding anything I could on Disney animation or Disney films. So the fact that I've done one of these books now and I can kind of contribute to that legacy is really cool.
well, what did you say? I think it was maybe on a podcast with Stanford or Rachel, or you talked about like a blank page is what every artist starts with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that that's the thing, like me and Johnny have tried our hand at screenplays or books and things like that. And the thing we've learned is that you've just got to get something on the page so you have
Yeah.
something to work with.
Yeah.
Johnny, you agree with that, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's the hardest part. Just getting it out, getting the first draft out is the hardest part.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
Absolutely.
and then being able to mold that into something, right? So
Yeah.
again, we talked in our last episode about your voice and how recognizable as a filmmaker we can hear you during your all the work that we watch of yours, right? So I heard your voice again, like reading this book is it's very fly in the wall, it's very honest, it's very, it's just very, I don't want to say raw, but it gives you kind of an insight into this history that I don't think is available. Like you can Wikipedia all this stuff, but I don't think there's an in-depth book like this that's out there. So
Right.
you talking about reading other Disney books, I really think that this tome can sit alongside those other books. I think this is an important book. I think it teaches an important history with it. But if you could just explain to us, number one, I think the title has a double meaning, if I'm not mistaken. But an
Hmm.
in-betweener is obviously something at Disney. Explain to us what an in-betweener is, and then explain to us how you came up with the title for the book and your inspiration for wanting to write this book.
Yeah. So an in-betweener, for those who don't know, is essentially an assistant to an animator. An animator does what are called the key poses, or sometimes referred to as the extremes. So if it's, you're animating someone swinging a bat, the first extreme would be the anticipation, the arms all the way back, the bat behind the player's head, ready to bring the swing forward. Maybe the next extreme might be kind of as the bat is coming around, not quite having hit the ball yet, but it's coming around the body. The next extreme might be contact with the baseball. And then the fourth extreme would be the follow through as the baseball bat swings back the opposite way behind the player. So let's say you have four extremes there, four key poses. But if you just film those four key poses, it's going to go pop, 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 pop. It's going to pop between
Yeah.
those drawings. So an in-betweener is the person that would go through and actually fill in the missing drawings to make it one fluid movement. So let's say between extreme number one and extreme number two, there might be the animator may have in the way they timed it out, they have said there's going to be two drawings in between those two extremes. And then between extreme 2 and 3, there's going to be one drawing. And then between 3 and 4, there's going to be, let's say, four drawings. So each of those in between sections are filled in by the in betweener.
Mm.
So to make one fluid movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautifully.
Okay. So as I was thinking about, what to call call this book and kind of thinking about animation and film and just, rolling all that stuff around in my head. One of the big themes of this book is this notion of liminal times, liminal times in our life, liminal meaning a time of transition,
Yeah.
a time when the old ways have died, the new ways have not been created yet, and you're stuck in this in-between time where there's uncertainty, there's maybe some darkness, there's some confusion. And again, you're still trying to find out what's the new normal that's ahead of us. We don't know yet. We know what it used to be. We don't know what it's going to be yet. And we're trying to make our way through that liminal time. That's an in-between. That's an in-between time, not in between drawings. But suddenly it kind of popped into my head. Oh, this is Disney in an in-between time. The extremes
Yeah.
in the historical sense were Walt's period of great success and then his death. And then the next extreme is, let's say, 84, 85, when Michael Eisner, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and Frank Wells came into the studio
Yeah.
and took over and created huge expansion, huge growth for the company. So those were the extremes. But in between those two times, the studio really wandered, kind of paralyzed by fear and uncertainty as to what a Disney movie was anymore in this time period between 66 to 86. So suddenly that metaphor kind of solidified. So it gave me that sense of the title. This is Disney in between. And then I explained this in the foreword, is that notion of the animator's extremes are beautiful drawings, but they don't have, but the in-betweens are the things that give those drawings context and meaning and movement and weight and
Yeah.
everything that makes good animation. And in the case of history, these in-between times or in-between times in our life, when again, maybe not a little darker than some of than the extremes. We have times of success, but then in between that, we have those times of uncertainty, of confusion, of darkness.
Yeah.
So it all seemed to kind of click, and it made sense to me. So that's why it's called Disney in Between. I hope that answer made sense. And then it sort of goes by extension. Then to your question, why write this book? This is, as you said, this is a time period in Disney history that's usually leapfrogged over in their history books.
Yeah.
It's all about Walt's time, his passing. They might point out a few movies in this time period. Maybe they talk about, Black Cauldron and Fox and the Hound and Rescuers in the animation world. Maybe they talk about the Black Hole. Maybe they talk about Pete's Dragon, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. But then very quickly we get on to, and then Eisner Katzenberg came in, which led to Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and the Touchstone Pictures boom, where you get things like Good Morning Vietnam and Three Men and a Baby and these, the explosion of Disney live action films that happened in the late 80s through the 90s. so those are, again, back to the extremes. Those are the extremes that are usually emphasized in the history books, and that in between time usually goes unnoticed. So I thought this is ripe to talk about. This is there's really fascinating stories in here and lots to again learn about these times of uncertainty, which I kind of feel like our world's a bit in one right now. I think, after COVID kind of upended things, we're still sort of reeling from it. And we've got all kinds of technological disruptions and we've got cultural disruptions. And,
Yeah.
just our society is changing, our world is changing. And I think we are in one of those liminal times right now.
Okay.
Well, Steve, first of all, I want to say congrats. It's a good book. The words I thought of for your book were educational, informative, fascinating, all those things. It was really good.
Thank you.
What I want to ask though is, like Darren mentioned, I'm trying to write a book, and it's taken me a long time. So,
Yeah.
how long did it take from your first conception of writing this book to publication? Like, how long was the process?
My first interview I conducted was in 2010. So that's was
Whoa.
really when it began. So it's been not quite 15 years from first interview to publication.
Wow.
And I probably interviewed for more than actually wrote. I think I didn't start writing until, speaking of COVID, until lockdown,
Yeah.
Okay.
when I was at home and still picking away at like my all my transcribed interviews and kind of rearranging things and trying to build an outline. And at one point, I just said, you know what, this is stupid. I should just start writing.
Yeah.
I have all this stuff, and I'm just like moving the pieces around, kind of procrastinating. So why not just do it? So I just dove in and wrote. So that was, yeah, 2010. So that was the last 5 years of the project. And
Okay.
then the first 10 was all the interviewing.
Was there ever a time when you thought, maybe I should just stop doing this? Maybe I should just scrap it because I'm going through that now. I kind of want to
Yeah,
give up on my book. But
yeah.
so how do you get through that phase? How do you get through the next just keep pushing through or what? What do you
Yeah, I mean, part of it for me is just to somehow keep I know it's not always easy to do, but like keep some sense of that initial flame
like
that
why you started in the first
inspired you
place
to
type
do
thing?
it, and just
Yeah,
keep saying, this is going to work, this is going to be good, this is worthwhile, plow through it. And then, as soon as I had something that I felt good with, I shared it with people too, just to get some fresh eyes on it. And
sure.
that was really helpful too, because you know how it is when you're in the middle of whatever, some kind of creative endeavor, and you cannot see the forest for the trees. You have no
Yeah.
idea what you're doing.
Yeah.
Um, I always find it helpful to step back and get some kind of fresh perspective. Um, so that was really helpful.
Keep moving forward, right?
Moving forward, yeah, pushing
S-
forward.
So, I mean, it sounds like you put a lot of time and a lot of effort into this, and that's good. So it's a little more reassuring that you started 14 years ago as opposed, oh, I just started writing this last year, because it's like you want
Yeah,
to be sure that you have all the research and everything combined. And it again, the way that the book is written, it's exhaustive, but it's never exhausting. It's very
okay.
breezy and it's fun to read. And so I was like just shooting through pages. Well,
Okay.
obviously you sent us the PDF copy, so it's scrolling through pages, but it's the same
Okay.
thing, right? It's like the thing with, and we talked about it with Robin Hood, is this transitional period. Disney goes through transitional periods all the time. It seems like you talk about Snow White and Pinocchio and Fantasia and Bambi, and Walt bankrupted the studio because he was just pushing instead of being lazy or just doing what everybody else is doing, he was making a statement. He was pushing himself to make the greatest art. And so when the war hit in World War II, they had to back off, and obviously funds ran out. And you look at Dumbo, which isn't, I love Dumbo, but you can tell some of the animation isn't quite as tight as the first few. So you
Yeah.
can tell that the budget is backed off. And then they did all the package films, which are rough to get through if you have to do them one at a time and stuff like that. And then they had to find themselves again when everybody came back. And then Cinderella came along. And then, like you talked about, you have that whole stretch. Sleeping Beauty again was very expensive. And then you had 101 Dalmatians, you had Jungle Book. And now we're at the part where Walt dies and the studio is in like kind of a turmoil. And
Mhm.
like we talked about in Robin Hood, I was never really interested in 101 Dalmatians all the way to The Little Mermaid because And I just thought it was me. I just thought, well, Disney is not my thing, right? I mean, those were the cartoons that I knew. I wasn't familiar with Snow White or Pinocchio, which I would become and fall in love with them later. But reading this book, I found out that it's not just me. The animators and the storytellers. They were also kind of confused, right? They were
Mhm.
kind of not, and they weren't moving forward. They were kind of afraid. You say, I think your last episode in the book, it says like fear is the greatest enemy of creativity. And I mean, what can you say? And but let me ask you that. But before I do that, reading this book made this so much more fascinating. I'm able to look at all these movies in a different way. And the live action stuff, I didn't consider that they made live action. I forgot about all that and how that ties in. But speak to us a little bit about that fear. What was it? I mean, is that what was tying them up? Just the fear of losing Walt and not knowing what to do?
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard this before, and I certainly talked about it in the book, but a very famous phrase of that time period of the post-Walt era, the first at least the first, 5, 6, 7 years after he passed was what would Walt do?
Mm,
That was the guiding question basically on everybody's minds is we need to do something. Well, what would Walt do? And let's do that.
mhm,
So, in order to preserve his legacy and not tarnish that and not be the ones that are going to go down in history as having been the ones that tarnished his legacy, they said, well, we're going to do exactly what he used to do. We're just going to keep doing the exact same things, the same types of movies,
mm,
this with the same crews, the same producers, directors, writers, basically the same kind of stable of actors that, these familiar faces that mostly came from the television world. Um, and we're just going to keep doing that because that's what Walt would do.
yeah,
But without that figurehead, without actually Walt being there, those movies ended up becoming really stale, really tired, especially in contrast with what was going on in the rest of Hollywood. Um, in the late 60s and early 70s as a young generation of filmmakers were coming into all the studios, that the old guard was sort of dying out.
yeah,
And these new filmmakers like Dennis Hopper, like Warren Beatty, the Scorseses, the Coppolas, the Brian De Palmas were coming in and doing really interesting things, really groundbreaking things, and things that reflected um, life and culture as it was during that time period. So then you had that, and then you had the Disney movies, which were sort of frozen in time, these kind of carbon copies, Xerox copies of things that were done before. I'm
yeah,
not trying to suggest that Disney should be making, Easy Rider or The Godfather or anything like that.
yeah, yeah,
But, you know, the question that the young people that were coming into Disney at the time and seeing what this older guard in Disney were doing, their questions were, how can you bring Disney, make it relevant again, not lose what the Disney name means, but make it relevant somehow to the world, make a Disney movie valuable again, make it something that people really want to go see.
yeah,
And ultimately, what happened was it wasn't until they were able to, I think, two things. One was to continue to bring in new talent from outside, because up until then it was all just sort of recycled internally.
yeah, right.
Bring in new animation artists, new directors, new producers in live action, also a new studio head that was a younger person, uh, to start asking those questions and really being able to do something about it, being able to actually make some change, and then to cut Walt loose. As harsh as that sounds, he really was the thing that was holding them back, or at least they were holding themselves back by clinging so tightly to him that they just, like, it was just a chain that was keeping them from taking off.
Yeah,
So this newer generation, still loving what Walt did and loving his influence and all the wonderful things he made, they were the ones that said, we got to let him go. We got to let him go and do something new. And so that's ultimately when it all started to change.
And that's rough. Like trying to cut your creator loose and
Yeah,
find your own way. But that's what Walt would want, right? He'd want you to
yeah,
keep pushing forward, which is, that whole thing is ironic. I like how you have the Kurt Russell quote. Like they used to say, "Nothing's changed since Walt died," and I used to say to myself, "That's just the problem because things were constantly changing under Walt Disney. It was never a status quo." And I think
yeah,
you're taught again. The great thing about the book is you go year by year, and so you're able to do when a project gestates and you're able to they keep popping up throughout the books like, oh, here's where we are now, we mentioned this before, here's where we are now, we mentioned this, like, and so it keeps coming up. So the Fox and the Hound, the way you're describing that, there's one section where you talked about the chief character is hit by a train,
mhm,
right? And in the book he's killed, but they decided not to do that here because again that fear comes in. They don't want to, well, it doesn't seem very Disney, but then it's like, yeah, but they killed Bambi's mom, right? It's
yeah,
like you can do that. It's just the way to do. I think they are just, again, I don't want to say chicken, but they were just afraid what that would do for audiences and would that turn people off. But I think, again, I think audiences, I think they could sense that something was off, and maybe that was my problem with those movies. Is it they weren't, something was clipped, something was
Yeah,
off.
they were
Like
being too safe, maybe.
they were
They
being
weren't
too
being
safe.
pushing
yeah,
any boundaries. Yeah.
yeah,
Just like you said, Steve, it's like they were just recycling the same thing and they just got so afraid, and all those things, and all these other animators were trying to push things, and again, so it's just so fascinating. And I
yeah,
love, even though Fox and the Hound, I think Ebert described it as it almost recaptures that Disney magic, and yeah, you can feel a lot of that, but yeah, they are holding themselves back,
yeah,
and to keep from doing things. But like, yeah, it's just, again, it's fascinating.
yeah,
And all the, just one thing that I want to mention here, Steve, is I kept
yeah.
writing down like the names of people
Uh-huh.
that were, I recognized names and they were up and coming again because you're talking about and they joined. So you have Ron Clements, John Musker, Don Hahn, John Lasseter, Brad Bird, Glenn Keane, Chris Buck, Mike Gabriel, Tim Burton, Henry Selick, Joe Ranth, Mark Dindal, Andreas Deha, Richard Rich, who directed Swan Princess that we
Yeah.
covered in earlier in our show. But like all those people, again, you who like were you able to talk to, I mean, what's the percentage, were you able to talk to all those people, or was it like secondhand? And I know some of the animators had passed on, but what was the ratio of people that you talked to versus people that you heard secondhand stories about?
It was for that group. I got Ron and John. I got Chris Buck and Mike Giamo and Mike Gabriel. Some of those that you didn't mention in there.
Yeah.
Um,
Right, there's so many. I knew I was gonna miss some.
yeah. So I got I tried to get as many as I could that because I needed to find out what's the story I wanted to tell. So as
Yeah,
if I still didn't feel like I had a sense of it yet, I wanted to keep talking to more people. So
right,
just kept pushing, trying to find folks. Really fortunate to get the folks that did give me their time. Live action side of things was a little bit trickier because most of the people that did live action in that first half of this in between time in the late 60s and the 70s are pretty much all gone. I mean, there's really because the again those were all people that were cultivated by Walt
right.
and made many films with Walt when he was still alive. So unfortunately, they've passed on. So that was a little more tricky. But I was able to find some folks like the director of the Black Cauldron, excuse me, director of the Black Hole,
Yeah.
and also Freaky Friday, Gary
Mm.
Nelson, the writer of Condor Man, also
Yeah,
who also very importantly was the fellow because he then moved into producing and he was the one that got the um, unpublished manuscript for Who Framed Roger Rabbit come
right.
across his desk and he said buy that now.
Yeah.
I can see that movie. I got it. So he was the one that brought that thing into existence at Disney.
Mm.
Obviously, his version never got made, and it took a long time for the one that did get made to actually
Right.
hit the theaters. But um, so I was able to kind of, with enough, I talked to enough people that I was able to get a good kind of complete through line. However, I'm still keeping compiling a list in my head of like, okay, if I did a second edition, what would I do? And I got there's more people now. Oh, I forgot about that person. Oh, I got to talk to that person.
Yeah.
So, but then the book would be twice as long.
You could do appendices like Lord of the Rings, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Of all those people you interviewed, was there anyone in particular that's kind of stood out to you, or someone that you couldn't wait to write their story, or whether like who were those
Ugh.
people? Anybody that stood out to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, the one of the ones I was on the phone with this person pinching myself that I was talking to him was this it was an actor named Charles Martin Smith,
Yeah,
who starred in a movie called Never Cry Wolf for
right.
Disney, was in a couple other Disney films as well, but is also known for American Graffiti. He was in
Yep.
The Untouchables. He's one of those faces you've seen everywhere. He's also become a director. But I grew up with this guy. I just saw him in so many things and loved so many of the movies that he was in.
Mm.
And particularly Never Cry Wolf was one of my favorites, even as a kid. When I saw that in the theater, I was just mesmerized by that film. So to be talking with him, I couldn't believe he even agreed to talk to me. Um, and then the fact that not only did he agree to talk to me, but he sat on the phone with me for at least, I would say, an hour and a half,
Yeah.
Wow.
um, talking about he was in Herbie Goes Bananas. He was in No Deposit, No Return, and then later in Never Cry Wolf, talking about all these films. And what was also great about that, which I tried to do, I tried to find other people that were like this, that had several projects throughout the course of this time period to get a sense of context, because Charles could talk about the 70s version of Disney, and then he could talk about the early 80s version of Disney,
Wow.
which were somewhat different because by the time the 80s hit, things were changing. And Never Cry Wolf was a huge departure for the studio. So
Mhm.
he got some great context to put all that stuff in. But I mean, that was a pinch me interview for me.
That's cool.
Well, it's
Yeah.
fascinating because we covered Charles Martin Smith in American Graffiti. We did that this
Mhm.
season and love that movie. We covered The Black Stallion, which Carol Ballard. Did
Yeah.
he have anything particular? I love the idea in the book, the way you describe it. And he shot hundreds of hours of footage. It seems like
Yeah.
he seems very Terrence Malick, and I loved hearing that
Yes.
stuff. But did Charles Martin Smith, again, who we do love, and that's great. I love that. That was your starstruck moment. But did he
Yeah.
mention anything about working with? Because we were just watching The Black Stallion, which I think I think Miller or somebody said that, oh, Black Stallion is the type of movie that Disney should be making.
Yeah.
But we were just so enamored with all the visuals in that movie. Did Charles Martin Smith say anything about Carol Ballard and how he worked?
Well, the main thing was I just I mean, number one, first and foremost, he's sort of a mad genius because the guy, shoots brilliant, beautiful footage,
Mm,
and is such a incredible storyteller, but also would just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot. And he was talking about how shot like, I think the first cut of the film of Never Cry Wolf was 4 hours or something like that.
yeah,
Um, uh, and they just and it was but it was very improvisatory. What I really thought was cool about what Charles was saying was that they did have a script, but most of the movie was kind of made up on the spot, made up while they were shooting in Alaska. Um, I think there was one day he said like they were just shooting his character watching the wolves, studying the wolves, and he waiting for the wolves to come out. And so Carol Ballard said, "Well, what could you do while you're waiting for the what did you make paper airplanes and
yeah.
do that?" So Charles Martin Smith made a bunch of paper airplanes and fired those around, and they shot that. That's not in the movie, but like they just made stuff up. And I love that because then you watch the movie and you think, wow, it's inspiring to me, that notion of how live action works and how you can you shoot these separate pieces and you put them to I know I'm talking like really obvious here, but I just find it fascinating that you have a basic thread, you can shoot a bunch of stuff, and then you can assemble it later on and actually make a narrative out of it, even if it didn't necessarily start as part of a narrative. I
Mm.
Yeah.
just That doesn't always work. Sometimes filmmakers do that and it crashes and burns, but in this case, I feel like it really worked. So it was neat to hear about that, that really improvisatory filmmaking, which was very un-Disney prior
Yeah,
to
right,
really un-Disney. Walt was not about that in
right.
his live action films.
Well, that's kind of an interesting segue. That Never Cry Wolf stands out. You're right. It's not very Disney, and it's very meditative and just again beautiful. It's it's kind of like poetry in a way. You're not kind of used to
Yeah.
that from the Disney. And I mentioned before that I all I thought about was like the animated stuff. But if you look at, you also go into all the live action productions, and I'm going to read some of these on here, and it's just some of these because we talk about you leapfrog past it, but there are some movies in here that are still a major part
Mm.
of my movie going life, and it just didn't hit me. So you, after the Jungle Book, you have stuff like Happiest Millionaire and Blackbeard's Ghost, the one and only genuine original family band. You have The Love Bug, for crying out loud, the Computer Wore Tennis Shoes, Barefoot Executive, Bed Knobs and Broomsticks you mentioned, Snowball Express, Herbie Rides Again, all the Herbie sequels, Escape to Witch Mountain, The Apple Dumpling Gang, No Deposit, No Return. I remember that. North Avenue Regulars. I watched that again just recently. I saw it as a kid, and I loved it. Like watching it just
Mhm.
within a few months, I thought it was great. Pete's Dragon, like you mentioned, um, The Black Hole. Midnight Madness was one that I gagged. Midnight Madness is watching that because going back in my days working at Suncoast, the video store in a local mall, like
Oh
Midnight
yeah.
Madness when that came out, I don't think Disney promoted it as a Disney movie because it was first
No.
PG, right? And
Mhm.
so when they released it and we got that in the video store, my manager was just crazy. Oh, I can't believe we have Midnight Madness. And then watching it just for the first time recently, I'm like, this is embarrassing. Like it's got so like it's got fat jokes, it's got gay jokes, there's a bunch of stuff in there that just doesn't. I don't even think it was funny back then, or
Yeah.
it's fascinating that was like jokey joke stuff or funny.
Right.
But then you also have like the note that I wrote down here. You have stuff like Tron and Watcher in the Woods and Return to Oz and Something Wicked This Way Comes, Popeye and Dragon Slayer, which were co-productions. But holy cow, like reading this book, I'm like, those are actually very strong movies that made an impression. Were
Mhm.
there first of all, were you familiar? Because I asked my wife, I kept asking her, have you seen this? Have you seen this? She's like, if it was a live action Disney movie, trust me, that was made in the 70s, 80s, we watched it. Like we had it every weekend. But how familiar were you? Because I know you're enamored with animation, but how enamored were you with the live action stuff? And then were there any movies in here and stories that surprised you? Like they just surprised me reading this list.
I was very aware of the Disney live action stuff growing up. I mean, this whole period of time was my childhood Disney. I think it was yours as well.
Yeah.
And so I was hyper focused. I loved the Walt era, but what I also loved was new Disney. It was new.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to discern whether it was cheesy or silly or good or bad. I just knew it was new Disney. And so, yeah, I didn't always, I didn't get to see them all when I was, growing up because sometimes they wouldn't come to a theater near us, or sometimes mom and dad just didn't take me to the movies to see that one.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but definitely aware of them. I mean, for me, some of uh, the real important ones, I put in air quotes, for me growing up was definitely Escape to Witch Mountain, Apple Dumpling Gang.
Hmm.
Those two were huge. I feel like I must have seen that. I can't tell you how many times I saw those between seeing them at school, seeing them at church, seeing them on the Wonderful World of Disney. Like, they just felt like they were on all the time during that time period.
Well,
Uh,
Knots and Conway are like the
yeah,
Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, or Hope and Crosby, like of the Disney era.
yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Pete's Dragon, Black Hole. I mean, Tron was a huge one for me too. I never got to see Something Wicked when it came out, but I've just grown to love that movie. I watch it
Oh,
every year
it's so
around this
atmospheric.
time,
It's
autumn.
great.
Yeah. I mean, could it be better? Yeah, there's always time. I watch it sometimes and I'm like rooting for it. Maybe this is the time it's going to be better. This time it's like, eh. But that said, I still love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the atmosphere, Jonathan Pryce's performance is just amazing. Um, so yeah, those are sort of, for me, kind of some of those standouts. As far as surprises, I'm trying to think of if there were surprises with movies. Um,
While you're thinking, I like that you gave reviews of Freaky Friday. That really cracked me up when
hmm,
they've switched and she mistakenly calls him daddy, and it like I thought that was really funny. Or
Yeah,
yeah, you talk about escape or return from Witch Mountain, and you're kind of disappointed
yeah.
with that. So I like that you, again, your voice, you're able to provide some commentary and some what didn't work and what worked. So I like that too.
Oh, good. I appreciate it.
But
Um,
we keep bringing up Peace Dragon, and that
yeah,
that was a big movie for me when I was a kid. I loved Peace Dragon. I grew up with it, and while reading that part of your book, like it stood out to me that there was an animator who was struggling to draw Elliot as good as Don Bluth could, and how that would frustrate Don Bluth. And it's like we all kind of experience that in our work life. We have someone who maybe not quite as good as you, but when you think about it, when you're watching these movies, you're thinking all these animators are the best in the world, but maybe they're
yeah.
not. Are there any animators that really just aren't up to the task? And how frustrating is that when you have somebody who can't do what you can do?
Yeah, I mean, there's always varying skill levels, and I think my personal response to that as a director is you find people's strengths and you play to them.
Yeah.
So if someone is not as strong as, because I think it's impossible to get people that are exactly have the exact same strengths and can do, all the same things as the next person can do.
Are the best animators the in-betweeners, or are they the ones who do the extremes? Like where
Well, the animators are the ones that do the extremes, and then the
okay.
assistants would be the ones that do the
Maybe the
in-betweens.
not so talented artists are the in-betweeners?
No, I would not say that.
Okay.
No. If you've ever had to in-betweening is tedious and really challenging, and it takes a really special person to be able to do that because it's really important.
Yes.
You have to have it. It is an integral part. It is an often overlooked part of the craft of hand-drawn animation. And thank the Lord that those people exist and that there are people with those brains because, everybody benefits from
Yeah.
those people are amazing artists
Well, one
for
of the
sure.
things that your book keeps bringing up is Disney is very supportive of their house people. So a lot of stuff was lateral moves. Like if you could show like impressive feats, they would move you on, and you showed interest, they could move you up. There was nothing against that. So yeah, you're
Mhm.
putting in the hard work to do those in between drawings, and you do enough of that. Like you keep your nose to the grindstone, and you just make sure that you stay inspired. You can move up to the next thing. And it's
Yeah.
fascinating. Like again, we mentioned Don Bluth, who's little bit of drama, obviously, in the
Mhm.
studio, but just again, your book is very objective, and the way that you describe Don Bluth is fascinating because if you know who Don Bluth is and the uproar that it caused when he left in the middle of Fox and the Hound, the way that he keeps coming up in the story, it's you're doing it the same way you do in the rest of the book, but if you know what's going on, it's kind of like a time bomb. Like you can sense something's coming, right?
Right.
And Bluth is like amassing his followers, and I don't want to say a cult, but like people that are kind of disillusioned with Disney and want something new. And I think that's what, again, we look at it negatively, like because Bluth kind of mutinied and left, right? But then Secret of Nim is a really strong movie in the
Hmm.
face of everything that was happening with Disney at the time. So the funny thing is that, and maybe you could say something about this, but like Disney had no competition for the longest time. I think Ralph Bakshi was around in the 70s, but that's like Felix the Cat or Fritz the Cat
Yeah.
and the Lord of the Rings stuff and a lot of really non-Disney things, right? But it's
Yeah.
like they hadn't been challenged, and then Don Bluth coming out of the woodwork and or not out, but working and then kind of leaving, making his own studio, making Land Before Time, making American Tail, and actually giving Disney some competition. Do you think was that a healthy period for Disney? Did that inspire people?
Yeah, I think it was extremely healthy for Disney to have that uh, level of competition. I mean, there was Nim, but then the one that really gave them a run for their money was American Tail
Yeah.
a couple of years later because that movie did extremely well. In fact, blew the Disney release for that year, which was The Great Mouse Detective, blew that one out of the water in terms of box office. And really solidified Bluth as a competitor, and it made Disney wake up and say, we really got to take care with what we're doing, and we really got to pay attention to the movies we're making because these things can really be financially successful. I mean, American Tail, I think, was probably one of the most financially successful films at the time.
Right.
But I also, just on the subject of the exodus of Bluth, I find it interesting that there's three um, different, I don't want to say exoduses because these are, some of them are individuals, but between, so you have Don Bluth leaving, you have John Lasseter leaving, and you have Jeffrey Katzenberg leaving many years later. And each one of those created a major level of competition for Disney, with Bluth
Right.
in his own studio, John with Pixar a few years later, and then Jeffrey with DreamWorks. So I find that very fascinating that you know, those three people um forged their own path. They went out and they created a new studio. They created a new way to produce animation. Um, and as I say in the book, you know, a lot of people sort of blamed a lot of people had very negative feelings about Don Bluth because he wanted to be an individual. He wanted to do things his way.
Right. Which
And
was not the Walt way, right? Walt was,
which was
those are
not the
his
Walt way.
movies. Yeah.
Yep. And was, yeah, was definitely not a, it was not, yeah, Bluth wanted to do his own thing within Disney, but when Disney kind of said that's not, when Don felt like, well, my way is not going to fit with Disney,
Mm.
he went off to do his own thing. Is that a bad thing? Some people do. Some people are individuals. Some people don't work well in a big corporate structure like that. Well, it wasn't really a corporation yet, but you know, a collective like that. Some people are individuals and they need to forge their own path. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that Don Bluth left. I think that's okay. If he wanted to do things his way, that was the better thing to do, is to actually leave and go do that instead of pulling the, you know, Disney animation apart from inside.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know.
Well,
Rambling
you
a
can
little.
argue it forced Disney to be better too. Like it forced them
Yeah,
to kind of like we were talking about before, break those boundaries and kind of, stop being so safe. And just, so competition is good. It's healthy. It's good for you.
absolutely. Yeah.
And they recognized that Pixar was a force to be reckoned with. So they obviously, well, let's, yeah, we'll have you be part of it. Like, come over here, we'll buy you, right? It's like
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
that whole thing. So, couple things. The last two things that I again, this book is so great, Steve. I
Oh,
can't.
thank you.
If you're a Disney fan, please you find this book and you won't regret it. But like the last two things I want to mention is number one, I loved my favorite part. I think was the Bernie Mattinson stuff.
Mm,
And what I love that it's funny because he's there, but then all of a sudden, oh, Bernie Mattinson has an office. You mentioned that. It's like, oh, he's still around. And then it starts snowballing in this thing where he's involved in everything. And I love, first of all, that the Black Cauldron was such a, nobody was on the same page and nobody could get, and that's why it took so long. And that's why the final product, I think, and again, giving us that context, I'm able to look at Black Cauldron and now go, I can see what they were attempting to do, but since nobody was on the same page with each other, that's why the movie suffers, and they just needed that clear vision. But I love that Mattinson decided, again, Mickey's Christmas Carol, how iconic and definitive a project was that during this time that people write off, right?
yeah,
And what I loved about it is not just that everybody loved working with Bernie and how he manipulated things. Like he would go and like figure out like, oh, if we argue, I'm gonna have you go to this. I can't remember who, but he sent him to this office. But then Bernie would
yeah,
call
Eric
the guy,
Larson.
yeah, and he would say, I want you to side this way. And they would, he'd make the artist think, oh, that's the best. I thought that was really funny. But Bernie did it in a way that was never manipulative. But what I really liked, Mickey's Christmas Carol, you talking to us about Winnie the Pooh during a Robin Hood episode, the way that
Mhm.
you're able to, and you talked about getting the people to do the voices or bringing in Craig Ferguson or figuring those things out and getting the right people for the right job. That reminded me a lot of what Mattinson was doing on Mickey's Christmas Carol, because
Mhm.
I love that he reached out to Clarence Nash and Nash was like, yeah, I'm more than happy to come back and do Donald one last time, right? I like that Alan Young was Scrooge McDuck in the Christmas Carol album, right? And so
Mhm.
he became the voice. I love that Irwin Coastal, like I want him to do the music, and he did that. It just reading that, I was like, oh, this reminds me of the way Steve described Winnie the Pooh to us. It's just
Oh,
how
cool.
everything came together, right?
Yeah.
And the music on that. So I just thought that was lovely. But only other thing that I really wanted to ask you about, and this is one of the things that I didn't know, is let's see, the morgue. That
Yeah.
was a mind blower to me. I mean, now it's the animation research library, right? But
Correct.
back then in the 70s, it was called the morgue. Can you explain what that is and how it's evolved over the decades, the methods that have been used to keep that art from degrading, and if you've been there
Yeah.
yourself?
Yeah, so the morgue was in the sort of sub-level, underground level of the animation building on the Disney lot in Burbank. And it was called the morgue because it's basically where they stored all the old artwork from past films, where they began scenes of animation, uh, backgrounds, layouts, all that stuff. They had shelves and shelves and shelves full of that stuff underground. Um, the problem was it was underground, and we're talking about artwork on paper with pencil.
Yeah.
And there's like, boilers down there, and it's damp, and there are bugs crawling around that like to eat paper.
Mm.
Um, and then there was also the fact that the studio didn't it was used for reference for artists. They could go down there if they wanted to look at how did somebody animate a tramp from Lady and the Tramp, a dog running. I'm going to look at this animation as reference because
Wow.
I'm animating a dog on Fox and the Hound, let's say, or whatever it might be. But beyond that, beyond reference, the studio didn't see any value in that artwork. And the person that was running it would, like, in order to make things fit better on the shelves, he would cut artwork,
Oh.
would roll up things and stick them in tubes.
Mm.
They were just not taken care of. So um, by the late 70s, I think, the early 80s, they started actually archiving what was down there. They started stamping all the pieces of artwork that they had, um, and kind of finding better ways of storing it so that they were a little more archivally sound. Um, Eventually, it was moved out of the animation building to a facility over just down the street from the studio in Glendale, across from where Imagineering is right now. And then it became known as the Animation Research Library. And now it's enormous. I don't even remember the amount of pieces of artwork they have in there. And it's like climate controlled and all these crazy, ways that they keep the artwork. And if you go over there to look at something, you got to put on little white gloves and very gingerly look through the pieces of paper. I have been over there to the ARL of today. We went over there for Winnie the Pooh to look at some old scenes of animation and backgrounds and stuff like that, just to kind of get a sense of that. Um, so I found that fascinating that was also like, it's not just the movies that I find fascinating that were integral to the studio's evolution during this time period. There's all these kind of internal institutions like that, there's the ARL, there's the archives that started during this time period, because they had to archive Walt's office after he passed away, and that was the first archive project, and by a guy named Dave Smith, who then went on to found the archives. Um, so that sort of, again, internal institutions at Disney, I thought, were also interesting to kind of point out that they got their start during this time period.
Well, it's a part of history, right? You want to
Yeah,
preserve all that. It's so important. Like
yeah,
the just having that the connection with old Winnie the Pooh and your new Winnie the Pooh, right? You
yeah.
need that. And so yeah, that was one of the things I was like, why have I never heard of this before? It's obvious that they want something like that to keep, but I was like, oh my gosh, they call it a morgue. And so it was
Yeah,
just like I just thought that was, and this is the kind of stuff that's in the book. So it makes so much of this history that again we just shrug off. It makes it so much more interesting now. There was so much going on, and I do want to mention who was the Tom Wilhite, right?
yeah,
Kind of the unsung. If you look at Roy Disney, if you look at Walt, if you look at Jeffrey Katzenberg, Eisner, stuff like that, Wilhite was the man during that period, right? I mean, he's that's I know I'd done research before, but I'm kind of sad that that's not a name that's more ingrained.
yeah. Tom should be much more well known for his contributions to Disney during this time period. To your point, Tom Wilhite came in to the studio, I believe it was in 76, to run the publicity department. because that was his experience before coming to Disney. So they brought him in to run publicity. And then because he made such an impression on Ron Miller at the time, a few years later, Ron actually promoted him to VP of production. So
Hmm.
essentially, he ran the whole studio. He oversaw animation and live action, but primarily live action.
Yeah.
And it was Tom who was responsible for um, buying Steven Lisberger's pitch for Tron.
Hmm.
Uh, Something Wicked This Way Comes was Tom's. Never Cry Wolf was Tom's. Tom started Touchstone Pictures. Now with Ron Miller, Ron Miller tends to get the credit for it, or really who gets the credit for it is Michael Eisner, who shouldn't get any credit for it
Yeah.
because he wasn't even there when it was started. He exploited it like crazy and used it to great advantage.
Hmm.
But it was Tom that started Touchstone, and Splash, the first Touchstone film, was also a project that Tom bought.
Yep.
And Roger Rabbit Tom was in charge when this producer I was mentioning earlier, Mark Sturtevant, when he wanted to buy that and make it into a film. So Tom was the Tom was there were a lot of young people that were coming in, but Tom was actually a young person in power,
Hmm.
towards the top of the food chain at the studio who could actually um, affect change. And he was doing that. He was opening the doors to outside filmmakers. He was bringing in people like Carol Ballard, um, uh, uh, Steven Lisberger, blanking. There's a movie called Tex that was based on an S.E. Hinton book.
Right.
And
Right.
the director I'm blanking on, but directed River's Edge a few years later,
Hmm.
Tim Hunter. Um, so he was doing that kind of thing. Unfortunately, he sort of got pushed out before he could really get the ball rolling.
Hmm.
So that's why Eisner and Katzenberg, sort of received most of the credit because that's when you really see the most aggressive change happening. With Tom, it was like Tom just started steering the ship,
He was
but
an
it's a big
in-betweener,
ship, you know?
right?
Yeah, yeah,
He didn't
yeah,
get, he's the artists get the credit for it, but it's the in-betweeners that have that important.
that's right.
That's again, if I have the morgue pop out, have Woolheit pop out. Like there's so
Yeah.
many people in here that you need to know that because this period in history gets overlooked, those names don't get brought up enough. I think that's really important. I love that you brought that up. John, was there anything else that you wanted to ask?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love how each chapter is a whole year. And you can just like,
Mm.
if you want to know what happened during that year, you just like
Just go
scroll
right
that
to it.
year. Oh,
Yep,
there you
yep.
go. That's what
Cool.
happened.
Good.
I love that. I think people will like this book. I really feel like it's something that if you're a Disney fan, you're going to want to read this book. You're going to
It's
want
a
to know
must.
all
Yeah.
this detail. It's a great history of Disney. My question is, what's next? Because you spent 14 years of your life doing this one. Is there something that's on the horizon? Do you have like another thing that you have, another big project in the works?
Uh, no, not at the moment. This is sort of the two big ones for the last year or so have been this book and then the live action short that I
Yeah.
did last year that I've been submitting to festivals and starting to kind of do that towards the end of this year. But those are, for all intents and purposes done, and now it's just getting them out into the world. So uh, I
Time
don't
for a
really,
vacation?
yeah, I guess so.
Are
Maybe
you
it's more
working
a
on
little
Little
bit like a
Mermaid? Is that what
mental
you're saying?
break. What's that?
Were you working on Little Mermaid, the show that Disney Plus is doing?
Oh yeah, I was working for a studio called Wild Canary,
Hmm.
and they're doing the Disney Junior Ariel show, which
Mm.
is on Disney Plus. I think it also is on Disney Channel. So I was storyboarding on that for a while. Um, I actually just went back to Disney Features about a month ago and have been storyboarding on an upcoming Disney Plus series about Tiana.
Yeah.
Sequel series to Princess and the Frog. So,
My,
Cool.
I don't know if he mentioned this last time, but Tiana's it's Savannah, my daughter, the one that
mm.
sent the message to you about appearing on the podcast. I don't know if you
Oh
remember.
yeah, yeah.
That's her favorite princess. And so I've been telling her about this. So she's going to be, that was the thing. Like one of the questions she wanted to ask is like, and she was just joking because I had my kids ask you all those questions last time. Her
Mhm.
first question was, how come he didn't work on Princess and the Frog? Tell him I'm mad at him. for not working on Prince. So the fact that you're working on Tiana, she's gonna love that, and I'm gonna be sure to
Looking up
mention
for
that
it.
to her. So
Yeah.
again, Disney in Between, September 10th. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. We'll try to have this episode out before that. I think we're gonna have this episode out next week. Please, like, if you're a Disney fan, this is a must. My last question for you: there was one quote in here, and I think it reminded me of you. And so there's,
Mm.
I'm sorry, Steve. Whenever you're on with this, there's going to be a part where I just gush over your work and how much I've just so enamored that you're on here and that you become a friend and we're on a first name basis and that you
Yeah.
put up with me annoying you on social media. But
Well,
this quote from Frank Thomas reminded me of you because I think I mentioned your Tarzan sketches and you
yeah.
worked on Garfield, right? And I think I wrote to you your Garfield sketches, they are alive. I can feel that there's a joy just from looking, and your Tarzan, I
Mm.
can there's a life to the drawings. He
Mm.
says in the book, you can't be looking over your shoulder, Frank Thomas, you can't be looking over your shoulder worrying about who's drawing better than you, but it's what you're doing with those drawings. Number one, is that when you wrote that in the book, is that something that speaks to you personally?
Yeah, I think that's been a pretty consistent thing about for me as an artist for most of my life is always comparing myself to other people and um, you know, like looking at the other people, the other kids' papers in class, like what are you
Cheating off
doing?
their
What are
homework,
you
yep.
doing? And boy, I'm not as good as that person. I'm not as good as that person. Okay, maybe I'm a little bit better than that person, but those people are, constantly comparing. I think we all do that. I mean, and not just for art. I think in life in general, we all fall victim to that every now and then. Um, so yeah, I won't say that I don't do it anymore, but the more I work and the older I get, the more confidence I have in what I can do. And I just try to keep my mind on that. Like, okay, you know that you have abilities, you know you can do this. Don't worry about how other people are doing it. Just do what you can do. Keep your mind on that. So I think that quote's very potent for me.
And like I said, what you're doing with your drawings and your work, it's working. Like
Thank
it's
you.
I get emotional, like it's still over Meet the Robinsons. I get emotional, like over Winnie the Pooh. I get emotional chatting with you. It's like, but you can tell that there's a voice in your drawings and the work that you're doing. And so yeah, in this book, I can hear you in this book. So yeah, this is great. Well, I kind of stole your thunder. I told about like talked about Amazon and stuff like that. But how you tell us, how can we get a hold of your book and just anything you want to kind of pitch about it?
Yeah, so like you said, September 10th is the official launch of the book. Um, should be in Barnes and Noble and also available on Amazon. Up until then, though, there's still time to pre-order it on Amazon, on
Mhm.
barnesandnoble.com, and on theoldmillpress.com. That is the publisher, theoldmillpress.com. You can go there and you can also pre-order. I believe you can still pre-order a signed copy at theoldmillpress.com.
I have. There's a signed copy right there. I'm trying
Hey.
to. I saw that. I was like, oh, look, I showed that to my family. Look, Steve signed that one just for me.
Yes. Yeah.
Again, thank you for coming on. And again, I know you're a busy filmmaker. I know that you've made several multi-million-dollar grossing blockbusters. But like anytime, like we'd love to have you back on just to chat about another movie. I mean, if you're open
Okay.
to that, we'd
Awesome.
love to be able to get your insight. And again, your voice is important to us.
Awesome. I would love that. I love listening to you guys talk about movies. So
Okay. Well, we really
anytime.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Okay. Well, we'll catch you a little bit on the flip side. And again, Disney in Between, great book, must own.